I want to start this the way it actually began, not with anger, not with shouting, but with a feeling I couldn't name at first because the strangest betrayals don't announce themselves loudly. They arrive quietly, almost politely. The kind that makes you doubt your own instincts before you ever doubt the people standing in front of you. Because when I opened the door to my house after 3 weeks away, helping my sister recover from a fall, the first thing that struck me wasn't relief or familiarity, it was wrongness, a heaviness in the air that didn't belong to me, a smell that wasn't soap or dinner or old wood, but something sharp and smoky, like something had been burned on purpose. As if the house itself had been told to forget, and before I even saw anyone, before I even set my suitcase down, I knew something had shifted, not just in the rooms, but in my place inside them, and then I heard laughter. Light and careless, drifting from down the hall, the kind of laughter people use when they're comfortable, when they believe they own the space they're standing in. And that's when I stepped inside and saw her, my son's wife, standing exactly where she'd never stood before, holding a glass like it belonged there, smiling in a way that didn't include me at all, a smile that said this moment was for her and the audience she'd imagined. Not for the woman who had built the walls she was leaning against, and I didn't say a word, because silence has a way of revealing things faster than confrontation ever could, and as I walked past her, past the living room that suddenly felt staged instead of lived in, I noticed how no one looked up, no one asked how my sister was, no one reached for my bag. It was as if I had already become background. A piece of furniture that had been moved once and forgotten, and with every step down the hallway my heart beat harder, not from fear but from recognition, because where my life had once been visible, it was now curated. And when I reached the doorway of what had always been my bedroom, the room I had slept in for decades, the room where I had prayed, grieved, healed, and grown old beside the man who helped me build this house, the door was open. Wide open like it had never been mine at all, and inside, everything was different, rearranged, replaced, rewritten. The bed dressed in colors I would never choose, the quilt gone, the furniture shifted like my memory had been an inconvenience. And standing in the middle of it all was my son's wife again, smiling, not apologetic, not nervous, but proud, like someone unveiling a renovation. And she spoke to someone beside her, not to me, and said casually that the room had been realigned, that it was better this way, lighter, cleaner, more suitable for the future. And that's when it landed, not as shock, but as clarity, because they hadn't just taken a room, they had taken a position. My position, and assigned it to someone else without discussion. And the worst part wasn't the furniture or the smell or the way my belongings had vanished without ceremony. It was the certainty in her voice, the certainty that I would accept it, that I would shrink around it, that I would quietly fold myself into whatever corner they allowed me, because that's what women like me are expected to do when we get older, become agreeable, become grateful, become invisible. And when she finally looked at me, really looked, her smile didn't falter, it sharpened, and she told me I could sleep on the couch for now, just until things settled. As if my life could be put on hold like a guest waiting for checkout time, and I glanced at my son, waiting for him to meet my eyes, to say something, anything, but he didn't. He stayed focused on his phone, muttering that it was temporary, that it wasn't a big deal, that I shouldn't make things uncomfortable. And that's when I understood the full shape of what had happened, not just that my bedroom was gone, but that my voice had been quietly voted out while I was away doing what I'd always done, helping family, showing up, putting others first, and I stood there holding the handle of my suitcase. The same suitcase I'd packed with care just weeks earlier, believing I was leaving my home exactly as I'd returned to it. And I realized no one was going to fight for me in that moment, not my son, not the woman standing in my room, not the house itself. And so I did the only thing they weren't prepared for. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I didn't demand explanations. I nodded slowly, calmly, as if I agreed, as if this was reasonable, as if I had already accepted my new place, and that nod did more to confuse them than any outburst ever could have. because people who plan to erase you rely on your reaction to justify their cruelty. And without it, they're left exposed. And that night, as I lay on the couch beneath a blanket that didn't quite cover my feet, listening to laughter drift from the room that used to be mine, I didn't sleep much, but I thought not about revenge, not about confrontation, but about patterns, about how easily space can be taken when someone believes you no longer have the authority to claim it, and about how quickly people assume silence means surrender. And as the house settled around me, unfamiliar and yet still mine in ways they hadn't considered, I made a decision so quiet it didn't feel like one yet, a decision to watch, to remember, and to let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe about me, because the truth was they thought I had returned diminished, tired, unaware. They thought I was just an old woman grateful to be allowed to stay, and that was their mistake. Because while they were busy celebrating the space they'd taken, they never once asked why I wasn't fighting for it, and they never thought to check what I still owned. What people don't understand about cruelty is that it doesn't always arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes wrapped in concern, delivered with a smile, dressed up as what's best for everyone. And that's exactly how the days unfolded after I was moved from my bedroom to the couch, not with open hostility, but with small, deliberate decisions that reminded me again and again that my presence was no longer central, that I was something to be managed rather than respected, because the first morning I woke up stiff and sore, my back aching from a night on cushions meant for sitting, not sleeping. My son's wife handed me a bottle of green juice without asking if I wanted it, and said it would be good for my circulation at my age. And she said it lightly, like advice, like care, but the words landed heavy. Because they weren't about health, they were about control, about reminding me that my body, like my space, was now something she felt entitled to comment on, and I thanked her anyway. Because gratitude is expected when you're being slowly pushed aside. And as the day went on, I noticed how the house had developed rules while I was gone, rules no one bothered to explain directly, but made sure I felt. Notes taped to the refrigerator about eating times, labels on shelves about who things belonged to, gentle reminders spoken just loudly enough for me to hear about not rearranging anything, about keeping energy clean, about not disrupting routines, and none of it was aggressive enough to protest without looking unreasonable, which is exactly the point, because polite cruelty thrives in that gray space where defending yourself makes you look difficult, and staying quiet makes you disappear a little more each day. And I started to understand that this wasn't about a room, it was about rewriting my role, turning me into a guest in my own life. Someone who should be thankful for leftovers and permission, and what hurt most wasn't the inconvenience, it was the intentionality, the way someone had taken the time to write those notes, to change passwords, to rearrange drawers, to decide which parts of the house were no longer mine, because that kind of effort requires thought, and thought requires belief, belief that I wouldn't challenge it, belief that I no longer had the standing to object. And every time I walked through the house, I felt it more clearly, the way conversations stopped when I entered a room, the way plans were made around me instead of with me, the way my name was used less and less, replaced by vague references like she or your mom, as if distance could be created simply by language. And I began to notice how easily people justify unkindness when they convince themselves it's temporary. That it's just until things settle, just until everyone adjusts, just until the older woman learns her place, and the house itself seemed to participate, doors closing softly, lights left off in rooms I used to love, familiar corners now staged for someone else's comfort, and at night, lying awake on that couch, I replayed every moment from the past few weeks, searching for the exact second I had been replaced, wondering if it happened while I was packing my sister's medications, or washing her hair, or sitting beside her hospital bed, believing I was still anchored somewhere solid, and the realization crept in slowly but firmly. They hadn't just wanted my room, they wanted my absence, not physically at first, but emotionally, socially, eventually completely, because erasing someone works best when you start small. When you make them doubt whether they're allowed to take up space at all. And I could feel it working, that quiet pressure to shrink, to apologize for existing, to stay out of the way. And there were moments, honest moments, when I considered it. When I thought maybe this was just how things were now, maybe peace meant compliance, maybe love meant adapting, but then I would catch the look on her face when she thought I wasn't watching, that flicker of satisfaction. And I knew this wasn't accidental, this was practiced, and that knowledge did something unexpected to me. It steadied me, because once you understand that something is intentional, you stop taking it personally and start observing it strategically. And I began to watch, to note what was said, what was written, what was implied, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Because people who believe you're powerless rarely bother to hide their behavior, and every small slight, every polite dismissal, every rule that didn't apply to anyone but me became part of a larger picture. One they assumed I was too tired or too old to see, and they mistook my quiet for acceptance, my stillness for defeat, not realizing that silence can be a form of listening, and listening can be preparation, because the truth is, when someone wants you gone, they don't push you out all at once. They make staying uncomfortable enough that leaving feels like your own idea. And as I lay there one night staring at the ceiling, hearing laughter drift from behind the closed door that used to be mine, I finally admitted to myself what I'd been avoiding since the day I returned. They weren't waiting for me to adjust. They were waiting for me to disappear. And what they didn't know, what they never considered, was that I wasn't disappearing at all. I was paying attention. And the longer they believed I had no power left, the more freely they revealed exactly how they treated someone they thought no longer mattered. There's a particular kind of loneliness that settles in when you're surrounded by people who act as if you're already gone. And by the time the third week rolled around, I had learned how to move through the house without being noticed, how to make my tea quietly, how to sit on the edge of the couch so I didn't leave an impression, how to fold myself into the background so smoothly that even I sometimes forgot I was there. And that's why the moment it changed didn't come from an adult, it came from a child, because children haven't yet learned how to pretend they don't see what makes them uncomfortable. And that evening, while the house was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that only happens when everyone else is out enjoying themselves, my granddaughter wandered into the living room, dragging a small stuffed animal behind her, her steps hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be in the same space as me. And she stood there for a long moment without speaking, just watching me, really watching, not the way adults glance past you, but the way children look when they're deciding whether to trust their instincts. And then she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and folded, holding it out to me with both hands as if it were important. And when I opened it, my breath caught because it was a piece of fabric, frayed at the edges, unmistakably familiar, a corner of the pillowcase I had used for years, the one I kept on my bed, the one that had been thrown away without my knowledge. And she whispered that she'd saved it before it was gone, that she thought I might want it. And in that moment, something inside me that had been slowly tightening finally loosened, because that small, quiet act told me what I had needed to hear since the day I came back, that I hadn't imagined any of it, that I hadn't exaggerated the loss, that someone else saw the erasure too. And the weight of that recognition was heavier than grief and lighter than hope. It was validation. And as I held that scrap of fabric, memories flooded in, not dramatic ones, just the ordinary moments that make a life. Nights of folding laundry, mornings waking up to sunlight through the window, the steady comfort of knowing where you belong, and my granddaughter climbed onto the couch beside me, curling up in a way that felt instinctive, familiar. Like this was how it was supposed to be, and she asked in a small voice if I missed my room. And I told her the truth, that I did, and she nodded as if that answered something for her, and said she liked how it used to smell. like cinnamon and clean sheets, and I realized then how deeply children absorb the atmosphere of a home, how they remember safety not in words but in scents and textures and routines. And sitting there with her head resting against my shoulder, I felt something shift because until that moment, I had been enduring, surviving day to day, telling myself that staying calm was enough. But now I understood that calm alone wasn't the goal, dignity was, and dignity doesn't mean disappearing quietly. It means knowing when to stand your ground even if you do it without noise. And after she went to bed, I stayed awake longer than usual, turning that piece of fabric over in my hands, tracing the worn stitching, and thinking about how easily people discard what they don't value, how quickly they assume no one will notice. And that's when a memory surfaced, not about the pillowcase, but about something else, something small and overlooked, something my husband had insisted on keeping years ago, even when it didn't match, even when it seemed unnecessary. And I remembered how he used to say that some things are only important when the world stops being kind. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became, because this wasn't the first time someone had tried to make me smaller. And it wasn't the first time I had chosen patience over reaction. But this time, patience wasn't about waiting for kindness to return. It was about waiting for the right moment to act. And as I finally lay back against the cushions, the house quiet around me, I felt a calm certainty settle in. Not fear, not anger, but readiness. Because the people who believe you're fading rarely notice when you start remembering. And what I was remembering now wasn't just who I had been in this house, but what had been put in place long before anyone imagined I would need it. And as I closed my eyes, holding that small piece of fabric close, I understood that what my granddaughter had given me wasn't just proof of my past, it was a reminder of my future, and that whatever had been taken from me so casually was not gone beyond reach, because there are things you can move. Things you can replace and things you can't erase no matter how hard you try, and the ones that can't be erased are usually the ones people forget to look for, which is exactly why they never saw what was coming next. People often assume that if you don't protest, you agree, and if you don't raise your voice, you have nothing to say, but that assumption only works on people who mistake noise for strength, because the truth is, I wasn't quiet because I was weak, I was quiet because I was thinking, and the difference between the two is everything, especially when you're dealing with people who believe they've already won, because once someone decides you no longer matter, they stop guarding themselves around you, they stop measuring their words, they stop imagining consequences, and that is when patience becomes power, something my husband understood long before I ever needed to, because years ago, in a moment that felt insignificant at the time, he told me that shouting only gives people something to push against, but waiting gives them space to expose themselves. And as the days passed and the house continued to operate as if I were an afterthought, that advice echoed louder than any argument ever could, guiding me through each small humiliation, each polite dismissal. Each moment where my presence was treated like a temporary inconvenience, because I wasn't collecting grievances, I was collecting clarity, watching how easily routines shifted when someone else took control, noticing what they touched and what they ignored, and most importantly, what they assumed was worthless, because people reveal their priorities by what they leave alone, and in their rush to remake the house in their image. There was one thing they never bothered to move, never bothered to replace, never bothered to question. An old object that blended so completely into the background that it might as well have been invisible. And that invisibility was exactly why it mattered, because my husband had never been sentimental about things. He valued purpose, intention, foresight, and when he insisted on keeping that particular item years ago, even when I thought it was unnecessary, he told me it was better to have something and never need it than to need it and never have it. And at the time I smiled and let it go, not knowing how much weight those words would carry later. And now, lying on the couch night after night, listening to the house breathe around me, I replayed that memory, piecing together fragments I had once dismissed as quirks, remembering how deliberate he was about paperwork, about backups, about contingencies no one else ever thought to ask about. And the more I remembered, the clearer it became that nothing he did was accidental, especially when it came to protecting the people he loved. And that realization didn't make me angry. It made me calm, because anger rushes you into mistakes, but calm lets you move quietly, deliberately, without drawing attention. And so I waited, not passively, but with intention, allowing the situation to unfold exactly as they believed it would, allowing them to grow more comfortable, more careless, more convinced that I had accepted my new role. And in that comfort, they said more than they should have, did more than they should have, and left behind more proof than they realized. Because when you believe someone has no authority, you don't bother hiding your disrespect, and I didn't need to confront them to know what they thought of me. Their actions spoke clearly enough, and in the middle of all that waiting, I took my first step, not a dramatic one, not something that would change the atmosphere overnight, but a single, deliberate action that shifted the balance without anyone noticing, a quiet reach towards something they had overlooked, something that still belonged to me in a way they hadn't considered. And as my fingers brushed against it, I felt a certainty settle in that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with readiness. Because once you understand that the outcome doesn't depend on how loudly you protest, but on how well you prepare, fear loses its grip. And you begin to move through the world differently, not reacting to what's being done to you, but aligning yourself with what's already been put in place. And as the days went on and they continued to act as if nothing could touch them, I let them. Because the most effective shift is the one that happens before anyone realizes the ground has moved. And by the time they would understand what silence really meant, the story would already be written, the consequences already set in motion. And all that would remain would be the moment when they finally noticed that my quiet had never been compliance at all. It had been the space in which everything else was arranged. There's a moment when people stop performing kindness and start revealing belief, and I recognized it by how relaxed they became around me, how freely they spoke as if I were furniture rather than a person. Because once someone decides you no longer count, they stop measuring the impact of their words, and that is when every comment becomes a confession, every joke a statement, every smile a signature, and I listened, not with hurt anymore, but with clarity, because the same phrases kept repeating themselves in different forms, remarks about energy, about space, about how things were better before I came back, about how hard it is to manage older people who don't know when to step aside, and none of it was said directly to me, which made it easier for them to believe it didn't matter, but it mattered deeply. Because what people say when they think you're beneath notice is the most honest version of what they believe. And as the days passed, that honesty accumulated, layering itself quietly into something solid, something undeniable, something that no amount of backtracking could erase. And I began to see how easily cruelty dresses itself up as humor, how laughter becomes a shield, how tone is used as an excuse, because if something is said lightly enough, the speaker believes it can't be held against them, and they rely on the assumption that no one is paying attention, that words evaporate the moment they leave the mouth, but words don't evaporate, they linger, they settle, they wait. And the house was full of them now, echoing in hallways, clinging to door frames, sinking into walls that had heard decades of truth before this shallow noise arrived. And I noticed how my son's confidence shifted during this time, how his casual dismissal slowly turned into unease, because somewhere beneath his avoidance, he sensed that something wasn't sitting right anymore, that the situation had crossed a line he hadn't intended to cross. And yet he still didn't step in, didn't interrupt, didn't correct the behavior happening in front of him. And that silence told me something important, not that he agreed with it all, but that he was willing to benefit from it. And benefiting from cruelty is still participation, even if you never raise your voice. and I could see the difference between him and his wife clearly now, because where he hesitated, she grew bolder, more certain, more convinced that nothing could touch her, and that confidence was her undoing, because confidence without caution breeds recklessness, and recklessness leaves traces. And there were moments, small moments, when she would repeat something she'd said earlier. Embellish it for effect, add a sharper edge, a wider smile, as if performing for an audience that no longer existed, and those moments stacked up quietly, creating a pattern that was impossible to dismiss once you knew where to look. And I realized then that the balance had already shifted, not because I had confronted anyone, not because I had demanded respect, but because I had allowed them to speak freely under the assumption that I had none, and that assumption was wrong. And the weight of that realization settled over me like calm, not triumph, because triumph is loud and fleeting, but certainty is quiet and enduring. And when the day came that the house filled with people again, laughter spilling into rooms that had once been sacred to me, I felt no urge to retreat, no urge to hide, because I knew something they didn't. I knew that every careless word spoken in comfort carries more consequence than a shouted accusation ever could. And as I sat there observing, watching how easily they dismissed my presence while still benefiting from my absence, I understood that this wasn't about changing their minds. It was about allowing them to show exactly who they were without interference, because people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe there is no cost. And by the time the cost appeared, it would be too late to edit what had already been said, too late to reframe intent, too late to pretend that none of it had been meant. And as the evening wound down and the house settled into its familiar hum, I felt something close to relief, because the hardest part was already over. The waiting, the watching, the restraint, and what lay ahead wasn't confrontation, it was confirmation. And the people who thought they were erasing me had unknowingly written the clearest record of their own behavior, one they wouldn't be able to laugh away, one they wouldn't be able to soften with smiles or excuses. Because words spoken in confidence don't disappear when the tone changes, they stay exactly where they are, waiting for the moment someone finally decides to listen, and that moment was closer than they realized. There are protections that don't look like protections until the moment you need them, and by the time I reached the point where waiting turned into action, I understood that what my husband had left behind was never meant to intimidate anyone. It was meant to activate when dignity was crossed, and that distinction mattered because nothing about what happened next felt dramatic or vengeful. It felt inevitable, like a door that had been unlocked years ago finally being opened. And when the mechanism moved, it moved cleanly, without noise, without warning, because safeguards designed by careful people don't announce themselves. They respond, and the moment it did, the balance of the house shifted in a way no amount of charm or confidence could reverse, because ownership isn't about who occupies space the loudest. It's about who holds authority when the rules are tested, and that authority had never left me. It had only been waiting for the condition that brought it forward, and as the truth surfaced, not as an argument but as a fact, I watched the expressions around me change, confusion replacing certainty, disbelief pushing against reality, because people who build their confidence on assumption crumble when those assumptions collapse. And I didn't need to explain myself, didn't need to justify my patience or my silence, because the framework that now governed the situation had been constructed long before any of them believed they were entitled to rewrite my place. And the clause itself wasn't cruel, it wasn't punitive, it was precise. Triggered not by emotion but by behavior, by clear markers that had already been crossed repeatedly. And what struck me most in that moment wasn't their reaction, it was my own, the absence of fear. The steady calm that comes when you know you are standing on solid ground, because for weeks I had been treated like a guest, like someone borrowing time, borrowing space, borrowing tolerance, and now, without raising my voice or pointing a finger, the roles corrected themselves, not through force but through structure. and the people who had mistaken my quiet for weakness suddenly found themselves without footing, scrambling to understand how something so significant could exist without their knowledge. And that confusion was telling, because it revealed how little they had ever considered me capable of foresight, how completely they had underestimated the life I had lived before they entered it. And as the implications settled in, the house felt different, not triumphant, not reclaimed in a sentimental way, but neutral again, like a place returning to its original alignment. And I realized then that justice doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like balance being restored, like a weight being lifted from a scale that had tipped too far in one direction. And in that balance, something unexpected happened. My attachment to the house loosened, because once I knew I couldn't be displaced without consent. The space itself lost its grip on me, and that clarity was powerful because it meant my choices were no longer reactive, they were deliberate. And as the reality of the clause settled into the room, I didn't rush to assert anything further. Didn't savor the moment, didn't demand apologies, because the activation itself was enough. It had spoken more clearly than any speech ever could. And the people standing in front of me finally understood that what they had treated as a temporary inconvenience was in fact a permanent boundary. And the most important part of that realization wasn't that I had regained control. It was that I had never truly lost it in the first place. And as the silence stretched, heavy but honest, I felt something shift inside me, not relief exactly, but certainty. The kind that tells you the story has passed a point of no return, because once authority reveals itself, everything that follows is choice, not survival. And that was when I knew the next decision would be mine alone. Not forced by circumstance or cruelty, but shaped by intention. And the people who had believed they could erase me were about to learn that ownership doesn't just change where you stand, it changes where you go next. Winning looks different when you've spent weeks being treated like you don't exist, because by the time the authority shifted back where it belonged, I wasn't hungry for apologies or explanations. I wasn't interested in watching anyone scramble to repair what they'd broken, and that surprised them, because they expected anger, expected triumph, expected me to cling to the house as proof that I had been right all along. But what they didn't understand was that once you're forced to see how easily a place can turn against you, ownership stops being about possession and starts being about choice. And I finally had that choice, not in theory, but in practice. And the first thing it gave me wasn't satisfaction. It gave me clarity, because standing in those rooms again, knowing no one could move me without my consent, I felt something unexpected: detachment, not bitterness, but awareness. The understanding that a home isn't defined by square footage or history alone. It's defined by whether you're allowed to exist there without explanation. And that permission had been violated in a way that couldn't be undone simply by restoring legal control. And my son sensed it too, the shift from conflict to finality, and when he came to me quietly, without defensiveness, without excuses, his voice carried something I hadn't heard in a long time: humility. And he said he hadn't realized how far things had gone, that he never intended for it to become cruel, and I listened. Not because I needed the explanation, but because listening had always been part of who I was, and I told him something simple: that intentions don't erase impact, and that silence in the face of harm still creates harm. And he didn't argue with that, didn't try to defend himself. He just nodded, because deep down he knew it was true, and I could see the weight of that recognition settle on him, not as punishment, but as consequence. And that mattered to me more than anger ever could, because consequences teach where fury only frightens. And as we stood there, surrounded by walls that held decades of memory, I realized I didn't need to prove anything further. Not to him, not to anyone, because my worth had never depended on their acknowledgement. It had only been delayed by their entitlement, and that delay was over, and the decision to leave wasn't made in a rush or in defiance. It was made in calm because calm allows you to see the difference between what you're owed and what you actually want. And what I wanted now was not to reclaim the past, but to choose the future. And so I began the process of letting go. Not dramatically, not with speeches or ultimatums, but methodically, choosing not to stay in a place where my presence had once been debated, and the house seemed to understand, rooms echoing differently as plans shifted. Objects becoming just objects again, and when the arrangements were set in motion, I didn't announce them, I didn't explain myself, because explanation is a courtesy, not an obligation. And by the time the reality of my decision became clear to them, it was already settled, irreversible, and what struck me most was how quickly power lost its appeal once it was no longer contested. Because the true victory wasn't in staying, it was in leaving on my own terms. And as I prepared to step away from a space that had once defined so much of my life, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I was escaping something, but because I was moving towards something else, something quieter, something chosen. And as the door closed behind me, not in anger but in resolution, I knew the story wasn't ending here. It was opening into something larger, something that extended beyond my own experience, because what I had learned wasn't just about reclaiming space, it was about recognizing how often people like me are erased slowly and politely. And that realization carried with it a responsibility, one that wouldn't allow me to simply move on and forget, because once you see the pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. And the question that followed me as I walked away wasn't whether I had won. It was what I would do with the power that had finally been returned to me. They thought I was fading because that's what people assume when someone stops explaining themselves. But what they never understood is that silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's incubation. And by the time I stepped fully into the life I chose, I wasn't carrying bitterness with me. I was carrying clarity, the kind that settles deep and doesn't need validation, because starting over didn't feel like loss. It felt like alignment, and the place I moved into was smaller, quieter, and entirely mine in a way the old house hadn't been for a long time, not because of ownership on paper, but because no one questioned my right to exist there. To take up space, to breathe without apology, and that difference changed everything. The mornings felt slower. The silence felt restorative instead of isolating, and for the first time in months, I noticed how my body relaxed when I entered a room, how my shoulders dropped instead of tightening, and in that calm, I began to reflect not just on what had happened to me, but on how often it happens to others, how easily older women are minimized, shuffled aside, spoken about as if they're already memories rather than people still living full. Complex lives, and once I saw that clearly, I couldn't look away because my story wasn't unique, it was familiar, repeated quietly in homes everywhere, disguised as practicality, convenience, or concern. And that realization planted something in me that felt heavier than anger and more enduring than satisfaction, purpose, because reclaiming my own dignity had been necessary, but it wasn't enough. And so I used what I had regained not to punish, not to humiliate, but to protect, to create something that would outlast the moment, something that didn't require my name or my face to be attached to it. Because the work mattered more than recognition, and in doing so, I felt the final weight lift, the one I hadn't even known I was carrying, the weight of needing anyone who had erased me to finally understand what they had done. Because understanding isn't required for healing, and closure doesn't always come from apologies. Sometimes it comes from building a life so complete that the past no longer demands explanation, and every now and then. When I think back to the woman who returned home expecting comfort and found displacement instead, I don't feel sadness. I feel compassion, not just for her, but for the version of me who thought endurance was the same as strength. Because I know better now, strength is knowing when to stay quiet and when to move, when to hold on and when to let go. And as I settled into this new chapter, surrounded by small, meaningful routines that belonged only to me, I realized something simple and profound. They never had the power they thought they did. They only had access, and access can be revoked quietly, decisively, without spectacle. And the story they tried to end became the foundation of something larger, something that reached beyond one house, one family, one injustice. And if there's anything this journey taught me, it's that erasure only works on those who believe they are finished, and I wasn't finished. I was watching, I was waiting, and when the moment arrived, I didn't raise my voice, I raised my life. And that choice echoed further than any argument ever could, because now, when I wake up each day in a space that belongs to me in every way that matters, I don't feel like someone who survived something. I feel like someone who finally stepped fully into herself, and that's the part they never saw coming, not the clause, not the outcome, but the fact that being underestimated was never my weakness, it was my advantage. And by the time they realized I hadn't faded at all, I was already gone, already whole, already building something that would quietly outlive their certainty.